This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 553 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, football fans, FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to bet on Week 4 of the NFL season. All you have to do is go to FanDuelSportsbook.com or download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Place a 3 or more leg same-game parlay wager with cash on any Week 4 NFL game. And if your bet loses, you can get a refund in site credit with a max refund of $10. Bet on Week 4 of the NFL season with FanDuel by heading over to the FanDuel Sportsbook today and placing a risk-free NFL same-game parlay. Must be 21 years or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit that expires in 7 days. Max refund $10. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Same game parlay available for multiple sports in all states on mobile/web. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG in Colorado, Iowa, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Virginia. 1-800-9-WITH-IT in Indiana. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789. Visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia or call 1-800-NEXT-STEP or text NEXT STEP to 53342 in Arizona. The first trend this week is that the Jets have run over 74% of their offensive plays this year while trailing by 10 or more points. The team that's in second is Jacksonville. They've run a little over 52% of their plays while trailing by double-digit points. One of the differences in fantasy between these two offenses is that Trevor Lawrence has been slinging it. Zach Wilson hasn't. Wilson has thrown it 15 or more air yards in just 16% of his attempts, despite the team always trailing big. Trevor Lawrence is at almost 25%, one of the highest rates in the league. Everyone on the Jets is tough to trust in fantasy football, and that includes Corey Davis, who now has back-to-back weeks finishing worse than wide receiver 50 in weekly PPR scoring. Listen to Brandin Cooks' target shares over the first 3 weeks of the season. 21.9%, 50%, 44%. Now, this likely isn't sustainable to this degree, but I do think that Cooks is a good example of something that I talk about on this show quite a bit. I don't completely agree with the idea that vacated targets matter a whole lot, but I also don't completely agree with the idea that they don't. What I mean by this is, when players leave an offense, in Cooks' case, we saw Will Fuller peace out this offseason, but when players leave an offense, the targets they accumulated don't just automatically get dispersed throughout that offense. Number one, that offense may get worse, which means less efficiency, less plays, and less volume for wide receivers. But number two, targets are earned. A player has to get open in order to see a target. Good wide receivers are seeing targets because they're getting open more frequently. In the case of Cooks, he's a good player who's also benefiting from there not being any real alternatives in the offense. So even though the Texans have been pretty mediocre offensively, Cooks is still benefiting because he's a good player who's seeing an inflated target share thanks to the lack of alternatives in that offense. Just thought that I'd share that logic again, since we have a pretty good example of why vacated targets can matter when a player is good. When a player isn't good, we shouldn't just assume he'll take on a large role. And for the record, no, Brandin Cooks will not finish the season with his current 38% target share. At least it's highly unlikely. I adjust fantasy points allowed. Think of it as looking at how many fantasy points a team is allowed to each position and then adjusting that for strength of opponent. Doing that adjustment gives me a number of points a team has allowed above or below expectation. When you look at fantasy points allowed so far this year to quarterbacks, the Broncos rank first. They're giving up 10.3 standard fantasy points per game. But they've also faced Daniel Jones, Trevor Lawrence, and Zach Wilson. Of course they've been good within this metric. You know which team actually ranks first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks through 3 weeks? Which, for the record, is still a pretty small sample size to work off of here. But it's the Chargers. The Chargers are 7th best in points allowed to the position. But they're first when you adjust that for opponent. Why? Well, they faced Washington in week 1, and then they faced Dak Prescott and Patrick Mahomes. They did work against Washington. Dak Prescott finished with just 7.5 points against them, and Patrick Mahomes scored 23. That's something to monitor moving forward, especially considering that they faced Derek Carr this week, who's been red hot. Trend 4 is about the Detroit Lions running backs. So far this season, they lead the league in percentage of targets that have gone to the running back position. Their running backs have almost a 33% target share so far this season. That's the highest in the league. It's not that much higher than Atlanta, surprisingly because of Cordero Patterson, but it's the highest in the league. But I think we should probably expect this team to lead the league in this category throughout the season. Will they be able to sustain a 33% target share? I think odds are against that happening. That would be the fourth highest that we've seen since 2011. But I don't think this is totally unsustainable. DeAndre Swift is someone that I would want on my fantasy roster. Jamal Williams is someone who will be a reasonable low-end RB2 or flex play. These Lions running backs should be heavily involved in the receiving game from here on out. This is not fluky. Dallas Goedert has a sub 12% target share on the season. Not only is that alarming, but over the last 2 weeks in each game, he's run fewer routes than teammate Zach Ertz. Ertz on the season now has the exact same target share in this offense. The splits for Goedert with and without Zach Ertz were well documented from last year. He's not close to the fantasy asset that people think that he is with a healthy Zach Ertz, even though he's the better pass catcher at this point in their careers. Now, I'd rather have Goedert than Ertz moving forward, but it's tough to assume that Goddard's just this tight end one. It was honestly tough to assume that entering the year. We had a pretty classic Saquon Barkley game on Sunday, at least usage-wise. Barkley, through the first 2 weeks of the season, averaged a running back rush share of about 74%. That jumped to 84% in week 3. His target shares across the first 2 games were 8.3% and 9.4%. On Sunday, it was 20%. He finally found the end zone, and even though he wasn't effective on the ground for the most part, the receiving work is what really allowed him to be a top 10 back in week 3. We need more of that, and I would expect more of that as we move forward. Cleveland has targeted their wide receivers at a league-low 39% rate. The team's wide receiver group has a 39% target share. Davante Adams alone has a 38.2% target share. I'm bringing this up this week, though, because we got Odell Beckham back in week 3. And I thought Beckham looked great. He ended up having a 31% target share, which accounted for 9 targets. He caught 5 of those for 77 yards. I honestly would lean buy more than sell with OBJ right now. Trend 8 this week is about the Saints' play calling. So far this season, no team has a lower pass rate than the Saints. Their pass-to-rush attempt ratio is just 0.68. The next team is Cleveland at 0.79. The difference is that Cleveland in neutral game scripts, they have a 1.22 pass-to-rush ratio. So Cleveland's been a lot more average in terms of pass rate or closer to average when games are close. The Saints' neutral script is 0.76. This is all hurting the pass catchers on that team. On the year, the Saints are averaging just 20.3 team targets per game. That's 4 less than any other team. It's tough to really trust anyone in this offense right now outside of Alvin Kamara. Speaking of pass rates, Cincinnati is doing something they just haven't done under Zach Taylor. They've been run heavy. They rank 24th in pass rate when games are within 6 points, and their overall pass to rush ratio is below 1. They've run more than they've passed so far this year. The reason this is so surprising is because of how the Bengals have operated with Zach Taylor. Over the last 2 seasons, Cincinnati's ranked 13th and 6th in overall pass rate, and 6th and 3rd in pass rate in neutral game script situations. Maybe this has to do with getting Joe Burrow back to 100%, or maybe the philosophy there has actually changed. Regardless, the Bengals are no longer the pass-heavy team that we thought that they would be. Lastly, we've got to give some love to Derek Carr. Carr's highest rate of throwing at 15 or more air yards came back in 2015. He was throwing it deep on 18.5% of his throws. So far this year, he's tied for the league lead with a 25% deep ball rate. Considering he's second in pass attempts, that deep ball rate is converting. No player is really close to him in passing yards. He has 1,203 yards versus Tom Brady, who's in second at 1,087. Some of that is because the Raiders have had extra time to play. But make no mistake, Derek Carr has looked very good, and he's done it against relatively tough opponents. Like I said on yesterday's show, we've got to recognize the weapons in this offense as fantasy relevant, or at least more than we thought entering the year. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly Sleeper Show.